Masechet Kiddushin Daf Samechet. We're dealing with the Mishnah that had a few different categories of forbidden relations and the consequences for each of them. The third category is where Kiddushin does not take effect with these two people, like in Arayot. Now we're trying to look for a proof. How do you know that Kiddushin does not take effect in this category? To remind ourselves, there are actually four different categories of prohibited relations that are going to come into play here. The most stringent one is that's mitabide shamayim, and that would be like the example we saw yesterday of a woman and her stepson. That's the most stringent. The next category is isure karet. That would be most of the arayot, most forbidden relations because they're closely related. And after that is isure lav, like a kohen to a divorcee or mamzer. And the least stringent category is prohibitions that come from a misvat aseh, like you said. The Torah says you're allowed to marry an Egyptian convert after 3 generations. So we infer from there that before 3 generations, it is prohibited. So then that's the least category. So we're focusing mostly on the isure karet, and we want to know what's your source that for all isure karet, the marriage is the kiddushin is not effective. We tried to learn it all from Achot Isha, where it says Visha lachota lo tikach. Lo tikach means not only that you're not allowed to get married, but it's impossible to get married. If one is or was married to one woman, you're not allowed to marry her sister while the ex-wife is still alive. And or current wife, or it doesn't matter if they're currently married or they get divorced, as long as one sister is alive, one cannot marry the other. Physically cannot. It won't take effect, even if you try to give a ring. So we know that's true for Achot Isha. We tried to learn the other Isure Karet by comparison to Achot Isha, but we got stuck because they are not comparable to Eshet Ish and Eshet Ach, where those two cases it's possible that to permit them. There are cases when you can permit it by divorce or through Yibum, and so they may be more lenient than a wife's sister, and so we cannot learn those two. And so that's where this line of argumentation got stuck. But now we're going to continue it with in a better way. Ela amar biyona v'item Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua amar kera kol asher ya'aseh mikol ha'toevot ha'ele ונכרתו הוגשו כל עריות כולם לאחות אישה, מה אחות אישה לה תפסה בקידושין, אף כל עריות כולם לה תפסה בקידושין. And so Rabbi Yona's chidush is that in the paragraph about the Arayot in Vayikra Yudchet, where it lists all of them, and then at the end it says all that whoever does any of these abominations will get karet. And so it's comparing all of the things in this paragraph together. So that what applies to one, Achot Isha, where there's no Kiddushin is not effective, is true for all the other things on the list. And the other things on the list include Eshet Ish, Eshet Ach. And so that leniencies that they happen to have don't matter because we have this pasuk, the concluding pasuk, that says the same is true for all of them. Okay, good. So now we know that all these Isure Karet, there is no kiddushin that is effective. Hold on, within that list on Vayikra Yudchet, it also says one is not allowed to be with a woman who's nida, whether they're married or she's single, doesn't matter. Isur nida. But we know that's not true. If someone would sleep with a nida, again, whether they're married or she's single, or someone sleeps with his own wife while she's a status of sotah, and those relations result in a child, the child is not a mamzer. And yet, nida is included in this list in Yudchet, so why not? And according to Rabbi Yonah, everything in the list should have the marriage should not be effective. But marriage with a nida is effective. In fact, sometimes if we're not able to calculate the date of a marriage perfectly, or just by surprise, it can happen that a bride is a nida, and then there's a big machloket about that. Do you push off the wedding? Do you keep the wedding? And you you have a chupat nida, so if you have a chupat nida, the marriage is still effective. It happens today sometimes. But this is in the list. So how does the Biur not account for that? Amar Chizkiya, Amar Kera, uti nidata alav afilu b'shat nidata tehe ba havaya. No, the pasuk regarding nida is an exception because it says utihi nidata alav. Utihi is a code word for the marriage, havaya, that there is marriage. So we learned that even if it's a time of, when a woman is in a time of nida, if you do Kiddushin, the Kiddushin is valid. Kiddushin being valid, the Kiddushin is valid, and the child is not a mamzer. Those go together, those two, right? When there's no marriage possible, then the child that results is a mamzer. When the marriage is possible, then it is effective, then the child is not a mamzer. Okay, so we see that nida is an exception, so we solve that problem. Mikedika lakushe nida leika lakusha lachot isha, mai chazita makeshat lehu lachot isha, akesha nida. So now we have a question, because now within that paragraph in Vayikra Yudchet, we have two different laws that we can use as a paradigm. We can compare all of the laws either to nida, where marriage works, or you can compare it to achot isha, where marriage does not work. Why did you choose to compare it to achot isha? So compare it instead to nida, and then we'll see that in all the rest of the laws in that paragraph, the marriage is effective. And the answer is kula v'chomra l'chora makashina. And when we have a choice, we could compare the laws to something that's lenient or something stringent. We follow the stringency. The stringency in this case would be that it's a very, it's a very harsh law. The law of achot isha is a stricter punishment, is a stricter law. So we're going to compare it to the strict one, where marriage is not effective. All right, all that is one answer. It's an acceptable answer to the question of how do we know that in Isureh Arayot the marriage is not effective. Okay, so that's one answer. We can learn it from Achot Isha. Now we're going to have a second answer. Rav Aha bar Yaakov Amar, Atya b'kav v'chomer mi yevama, ma yevama shi belav, la tavse b'kiddushin, chayve mitot, chayve karet, lo kol sheken. He says we can learn it from a yevama. Regarding yevama, it says, lo tiyeh eshet hamet hachusa. If a man dies without children, so the widow cannot marry outside. Lo tiyeh. It says the word lo tiyeh, which again is a code word that means no marriage. And we're learning it not only as a prohibition, but also as even a possibility. If she tries to go and do a marriage ceremony with someone else, it won't work. And now this is a kavachomer, because the prohibition of a yevama to marry an outsider is merely a lav, less than karet. And if in isur lav, kiddushin does not take effect, in chayeve mitot and chayeve keretot, the two levels above it, all the more so, kiddushin will not take effect. That seems like a good proof. But we ask, wait, then you're going to apply the same thing to other isurei lavin. Amarav papa chayave lavin behedjaketi behu. So other chayave lavin, like most of the prohibitions of a kohen, the kohen marrying a divorcee, or Kohen Gadol marrying an almana, right? These are isurei lav. But everybody knows that if you try to marry, not everybody, the majority opinion says that if you try to do these marriages, they are effective. If you just said that we're going to use the Yevama as a paradigm, that's in Isur Lav, so then you have to say that all Isurei Lavin are prohibited. So the Papa says, no, we have another pasuk that tells us Chayave Lavin, marriage is effective. What is the pasuk? Ki tiyena li'ish sheten hashim achat ahuba v'achat senua v'chi yesh senua lifnei makom v'abal lifnei hamakom. When the Torah talks about the law of someone who has two wives, one is beloved and one is hated. What do you mean, beloved and hated? Hated by whom? By God? Does God like one person more than another? God likes everybody equally. And so it's not talking in that sense. Now the peshat is that the husband likes one and doesn't like the other, and he can't give double portion to the son of the beloved one. He has to give the double portion to the oldest, to the firstborn. Okay, that's the context, is that beloved by the husband. But this is a derasha. We say, Ela ahoba, ahoba benisu'eha, sinu'a, sinu'a benisu'eha. Rather, though ahova means that the beloved, because that's a proper marriage. So yes, it's beloved in some sense by God. Not that God loves this person particular better, but loves the marriage where it's a permitted marriage. So we're talking about a guy who is married to two women. One is a permitted marriage and one is a prohibited marriage. And yet it says ki tiena. Again, tiena is a word that always means marriage. And so you see that there are marriages that are forbidden, yet it's possible to effectuate a marriage. And from here we learn that Isureh Lavin, even though it's prohibited, still you can effectuate a marriage. And so the Yibum, the Yavama, going outside is an exception, but we know from here that other Isureh Lav, the marriage is effective. Good. So far so good. From the majority opinions. But Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He's much more stringent when it comes to these things. And he says that even for a general Chayave Lavin, the Kiddushin is not effective. So what is he going to do with Kiteyena? Why does he need this pasuk about Kiteyena? When could you have in Isur Lav that where you would have an effective marriage? And he can answer about Almana Kohen Gadol uch Rabbi Simai. The Almana to Kohen Gadol, according to Rabbi Simai's interpretation of Rabbi Akiva, which we saw once before, is that this is effective. The Tanya Rabbi Simai Omer min hakol haya Rabbi Akiva oseh mamzer chutz b'almana l'Kohen Gadol sharei amra Torah lo yechalel chilulim oseh ve'en oseh mamzerut. Rabbi Akiva would say any prohibited marriage creates a mamzer. And creating a mamzer comes along with, there is no kiddushin, except for Almanato Kohen Gadol, because it says, don't do this so that you will not create a halal. Now, you'd only create a halal if they're married. So that's the problem, that you're going to create a halal, not that you're going to create mamzerim. And so we see from here that if a Kohen Gadol marries an almana, he will not create mamzerim, he will only create a halalim, and that means that the marriage is effective. If it wasn't effective, it would create a mamzer. So according to Rabbi Akiva, the pasuk regarding a man who has two wives can be referring to a Kohen Gadol. Okay, this is a big stretch. It's a big push to say this whole law of a man who has two wives, one loved, one hated. The hated is only talking about a case of a Kohen Gadol to an almana. That's the only possible prohibited marriage that it takes effect. But that's what with that we could answer that. That's what Rabbi Akiva would do with that pasuk. All right, that's good for Rabbi Semai. However, Rabbi Shebab damar bo v'nisvach al Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef shaya omer kol she'en lo bi'a b'Yisrael havalad mamzer hanich al Rabbi Shebab ila pokem Rabbi Semai ka'ateh shapir. Now, what are we going to do with Rabbi Shebab? Because he disagrees with Rabbi Simai, and he says, no, let's come and argue, shout at Rabbi Akiva, because he said anytime that there is no bi'ah, that bi'ah is prohibited, the child will be a mamzer across the board, right? Even with Almanan Kohen Gadol. So if Rabbi Yeshevav is only coming to argue against Rabbi Simai, then we could still figure it out, because maybe in that interpretation, he's only saying that according to Rabbi Akiva, Almana l'Kohen Gadol is prohibited, but a prohibition that comes from Misvat Aseh, still the Rabbi Akiva would say is permitted, and so the pasuk about a man and two women can be talking about a misvat aseh. However, but if Rabbi Shebab was actually not responding directly to Rabbi Simai, but was saying a statement on his own, see, a lot of times in Talmud, it'll bring two disparate statements of two different rabbis and put them together. Sometimes those two rabbis were speaking to each other. Sometimes they weren't speaking to each other, and we're just collecting them in one. So if Rabbi Shebab was not responding to Rabbi Simai, he was just saying, we have to come and yell at Rabbi Akiva, because he says any Isur Bi'ah, that would include all Isurim, all four categories, even the Misvat, even Hayaveh Aseh, So then there is no case where you have a prohibited marriage and the marriage is effectuated. So what is he going to do with the case of a man who was married to two women? Who would be the hated woman in that case? And the answer is be'olah lekohen gadol. Kohen gadol. See, he's not allowed to marry a divorcee like any others, and he can't marry an almanah. Also, there's a mitzvah aseh. He has to marry a betula. If he marries someone, she's not necessarily an almanah. She's not an almanah. But she's a be'ula. She's not a betula. So that is one of the chayavei aseh. And in that case, even according to the Rabbi Shabab, Rabbi Akiva would agree that the marriage is effective. How do you know? Because this is a mitzvah aseh that applies only to a Kohen Gadol and not anyone else, and therefore it's less stringent, and so we solve that problem even according to the Rabbi Shabab's expanded interpretation of Rabbi Akiva, so everything's good. Now, v'Rabbanan, ad mokila b'chayave lavi nukma b'chayave aseh. Back to Rabbanan, about whom we asked, you have a paradigm from a Yevama who cannot marry anybody else, and a Sur Lav, and therefore and the Kiddushin does not take effect. We asked, well, why don't you apply that to every other Isur Lav for Rabbanan? But for Rabbanan, that's not true. And so he says, we'll learn from the Kitien Ha'le'ish Shetenashim that over there, that's a prohibition, a Lav prohibition, and the Kiddushin works. Wait, how'd you know that is talking about a Lav prohibition? Maybe it's talking about Chayaveh Aseh. We have a lower case that we can apply that to, and you don't have to assume it's a Lav, and so therefore you have no proof. So what are you going to do with Rabbanan? Why not just say that pasuk is talking about Chayaveh Aseh? And their answer is Hayne Chayaveh Aseh b'maynin hu ish shetehen misriot shetehen senuot. They're reading that if a man has two wives, if it says two wives, they have to be the same, they have to have the same level of prohibition. So now, what are we talking about? If both of them are mitzriot, well then, they're both sinuot, they're both hated. But the Torah says one loved and one hated. So, but if one is Egyptian and one is Israelite, so one is prohibited and one is permitted, but Sheten Hashim says they have to be the same, meaning they have to be from the same nation, and this would not be from the same nation. And if you want to say it only applies to a Be'olah to Kohen Gadol, like Rabbi Akiva said, according to Rabbi Shabab, it doesn't say Ki Tiena leKohen Sheten Hashim, it says Ki Tiena leIsh, so it has to apply to any case, and therefore it can't be talking about a Chayaveh, one of the Chayaveh Aseh, because there's no Chayuv Aseh that would apply, that you have two women where one is permitted and one is prohibited, and they are from the same nation. Therefore, it has to be talking about Isureh Lav. So that applies to other Jewish people that one would be, let's say Mamzer or Kohen to a divorcee, and one not, so they're from the same nation, and one is permitted and one is prohibited. Rabbi Akiva, what is he going to answer to this last point, that it doesn't say Kohen, it doesn't say Kohen, it says Ki Tiena leIsh, Be'al korchech shavke likra, Taveh dachik u'mokeh al nafsheh. So Rabbi Akiva has no choice. He has to leave the pasuk in this difficult state, because it's difficult in and of itself. In other words, once you have all the presumptions that Rabbi Akiva has from elsewhere, that any Isur Lav, it does not, any Isur Lav, and even Hayaveh Aseh, the marriage does not take effect, and now you have here a case where Sinu'ah, where it does take effect, so he's forced to say, okay, I could find one minimal thing that is talking about that I can agree with, but he has no choice but to interpret this pasuk in a forced manner. Rabbi Akiva is forced, but Rabbanan are not forced to have such a dohak, and therefore they say that pasuk is talking about general Isureh Lav, there's no mamzer, the marriage is effective, only Isureh Karet and up. That's where the marriage is ineffective. Isur Lav, the only exception was Yevama, that marries outside. We next move on to the last category in the Mishnah, V'chol mi she'en la'alav, any woman who cannot do Kiddushin with anybody because she's not Jewish or she is a shifcha kena'anit. In that case, the offspring follows the status of the mother. So let's see sources for this. Shifcha kena'anit minelan, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Kira, Shivu lachem po ayim hachamor, am hadome lachamor. So first of all, how do you know that the Kiddushin is not effective? Because the pasuk in Akedat Yitzchak, Abraham says, sit here with the donkeys. So that means he tosses out to his slaves. They are similar to donkeys. We don't like to compare people to animals, but here it's in the sense that just like animals cannot get married, so too Jew and non-Jew cannot perform a marriage. Ashkechan de la tafseh ba kiddushe. Okay, this means that the Kiddushin does not work. But how do you know that the child, velada kimota minelan, that the child will follow the status of the mother? We learn this from the pasuk when you have someone owns an shifcha kenanit and he also owns an eved ivri. He can have the eved ivri produce children for him with the shifcha kenanit. When the eved ivri goes free after 6 years, then the woman and her children stay with the master. So you see that regarding a shifcha kenanit, the children follow the mother, and they will be Canaanite servants, and they do not follow the father, who is Hebrew. Okay, so that solves the questions for shifcha kenanit. Nochrit minelan. How do you know that Kiddushin does not work with a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman? Amar Kira lo titchaten bam. As pasuk says, do not marry them. Now this doesn't mean, we're taking this to mean not only that one is not allowed to marry a non-Jewish woman, but also that the marriage would not take effect. Ashkechana de la taseh b'kiddushe velada kimota minela. Now we know that the Kiddushin does not take effect. How do you know that if they do have relations and they have a child, that the child will not be Jewish like the non-Jewish mother? Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Amar Kera ki yasir bincha me'acharai. It says you shall not give your daughter to his son, because if you do that, so this is your daughter, so that means it's a Jewish woman with a non-Jewish son. Then, if they have a son, that would be your grandchild. Your grandchild will turn away from following me. So now it calls it your grandchild. Bincha bam Yisraelit karui bincha. So that this is your daughter who's Jewish, has a child, is called your child, meaning the child is Jewish, follows the mother. Ben bincha bam mina nochrit karui bincha ela bena. But if it was the other way around, if it was a Jewish man who had a child with a non-Jewish woman, then that would not be called your grandchild, because it would follow its mother, which in that case is not Jewish. Amar Ravina, Shema Amina, Ben Bitecha Bamina Nochri, Karui Ben. So Ravina says, we can see from here that your grandchild from your daughter, who is with a non-Jew, is called your grandchild, because the mother is Jewish. Now we ask, according to Ravina, who makes this conclusion, what would he say about a non-Jewish man or an Eved Kena'ani that has a child with a Bat Israel, with a regular Jewish woman? Would that child be a mamzer? The question is as follows. If there's some child that is not Jewish, right, like the other way around, if the mother is not Jewish, now and then the child will not be Jewish. Well, a non-Jewish child cannot be a mamzer. Mamzer, the category of mamzer only applies to Jews, not to non-Jews. So that's fine. The Mishnah was talking about a case where the mother was Jewish, and so the mother was not Jewish, and therefore the child is not Jewish and not a mamzer. But what if it's the other way around, and the father is not Jewish, but the mother is Jewish, in which case you just said that the child is Jewish. Since this child is Jewish, but is the result of a prohibited relation, and a prohibited relation that in which the marriage does not take effect, so then the child should be a mamzer. You can apply a mamzer to this, in this case, to the child, because the child is Jewish. So we should follow the general rule that was in the third category of the Mishnah, that anytime the marriage does not take effect and they have a child, and the child is Jewish, then the child should be a mamzer. Would you say that? And we say no. No, even though the child is not totally kosher, but not a mamzer, but rather it's called pasul. What will be the result of being pasul? Talmud Yerushalmi says that child would not be able to marry a kohen. And there's lots of discussion about that. But otherwise, otherwise that child is fine. And lahalacha, we don't follow that Yerushalmi. And so the child of a Jewish woman with a non-Jewish man is considered Jewish and can marry other Jews. Hahu b'shiv'a goyim ketiv. Okay, fine. Now you brought that pasuk from Devarim that says the grandchild, your grandchild. That has to do with the 7 nations. So if there's a child from and the man is one of the 7 nations, then that will result. And those are stringent because those are people that are going to lead your grandchild astray. So I know that this is true in that case. But how about Sharumot Umot Minelan? What about other nations? And is that also true? That if there's a marriage between someone from another nation and a Jew, also the marriage would not be good, and the child follows the mom. Yes, it does apply, because even though in Devarim it talks about the 7 nations, it gives a reason, and the reason is because that if the father is Jewish and the mother is not Jewish, then this is not allowed, because the non-Jewish parent will turn away the child. So it gives a reason. And so since the reason, anytime the reason applies, and it would apply even if it's not one of the 7 nations, and back then, pretty much all the nations were idolatrous, and therefore, even if it's in some nation that's outside the land of Israel, it will still have the problem that the non-Jewish parent will turn the child away from God, and therefore would equally be prohibited. Now that expansion makes sense, is according to Rabbi Shimon, because he says that we expound the reason of the commandment. Here it gives a reason, and Rabbi Shimon says we can use the reason of the commandment in order to apply which cases in order to figure out which cases it applies to. And so he says the reason is not just an add-on, like, oh, this happens to be the reason, but the reason can help us define the scope of it. And so anytime that there's a nation that's going to be pagan and going to lead your child astray, there the prohibition applies to marry out, and therefore all the consequences are also the same, that the marriage is not good and the child follows the mother. That's good for Rabbi Shimon. But Rabbanan say, when the Torah gives a reason, you cannot use that reason to help you define the scope of the prohibition. So then what are they going to do? Regarding a captive woman, right, the Eshet Yifat To'ar, it says after you do this whole process, then she can be with you, and you can be her husband. So mikala de mikara la tafseh ba kiddushin. You see that only after you do the whole 30-day ceremony with her, then you can marry her. But before that, you cannot marry her, and this applies to all nations. All outside nations. So you see that Kiddushin does not work between any Jew and a Jew and any non-Jew. Now we see that Kiddushin won't work unless you go through that process. How do you know that if there is a child, that the child will follow the mother? From back to the pasuk of a man has 2 wives, one beloved and one hated, meaning a prohibited marriage. So we see that only when the marriage is effective, kitiyena, that's when the child will be yours. And of the fathers, right? Because an ish who has 2 wives. However, if there's no marriage possible, like when a man marries non-Jews, and we already established that a man who tries to marry a non-Jew, the Kiddushin is not effective, so then we don't call that v'yaldu lo, and he has children, because the children that he has with those non-Jewish wives are not his. They belong to them. And that's how we know that a man that marries a non-Jewish woman, the children follow the woman, and that applies to all non-Jewish nations. Now, once you have this derivation, we could apply it back to Shivcha Kena'anit. See, we had a derivation before about Shivcha Kena'anit, but actually we could derive the same thing here. That in the Shivcha Kena'anit also, there's no Havaya, there's no possibility of marriage, so then the children should follow the Shivcha Kena'anit. So I can derive that from here. And yes, so in fact, you're right, we can. In that case, why do you need the pasuk that we originally brought to teach me that the children of Shivcha Kena'anit follow the mother? The pasuk regarding a Hebrew slave that has a child with a Shivcha Kena'anit, that the children will be with her, will stay with her, with the master. So why do I need that pasuk? That pasuk is actually going to teach us something else in this following Baraita. If someone says he owns a shivcha and she has children, and he says, you go free, but your children stay with me as slaves, so according to the Biyoseh, it doesn't work. The child has the same slave status as the mother, and if he frees the mother, the children go with her, which is quite nice, that the family should stick together, and you can't just free the slave and she goes free and then loses her children. Hachamim say it is possible for the master to free the mother, and the children will remain slaves. As it says, the mother and the children will be the owners. We ask, "My Talmudah, wait, has this pasuk explained Chachamim?" It actually seems to be the opposite. They're together. Rava says, yes, indeed. The pasuk is not explaining the source for Chachamim, but rather the source for the Biyoseh Galili, that the mother and the child together will be the masters. They only will continue to belong to the masters if they are all together under the master. If the master frees the mother, then the children will go free as well. So we need this pasuk not to teach us the law that the children of Shivcha Kena'anit follows the mother, because we already know that from Ki Tihena. Instead, this pasuk teaches us the law of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.